Hey everyone, welcome back to Sooth Slayer. I am your host, David, and today we're going to tackle one of the longest running myths in religious history. The claim that Satan is a fallen star called Lucifer, the ruler of Hades and the tormentor of the damned. But is any part of this actually backed up by the Bible? Well, the shocking answer is no. The Bible does not call Satan any of these things. This entire misconception about Satan comes from the book of Isaiah. In chapter 14, God tells Isaiah to mock the king of Babylon. Isaiah then uses poetic imagery to taunt this arrogant king by comparing him to the bright morning star, the only star that you can see at sunrise. However, like the morning star, the king's reign quickly fades after sunrise. And here's the thing. When Isaiah wrote this poetic taunt, there was already a myth in the ancient Near East about a deity named Athtar who was associated with Venus, the morning star. According to the Canaanite tradition, Athtar tried to ascend to Baal's throne, but he failed miserably and descended down in shame. And a similar story was also circulating in the Babylonian mythology about Ishtar and Kingu. These were all common myths about Venus, the morning star. And that's exactly why Isaiah used this poetic imagery to mock the king of Babylon. Isaiah knew that the king's audience would have known that the king of Babylon was being compared to a failed usurper. Centuries later, when the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Latin, the Hebrew word for the morning star, Hallel, was translated as Lucifer, the Latin word for light bearer or morning star. And all along, this was just simply a poetic description of the king of Babylon, certainly not an actual name, but over time, the church turned it into a proper name for Satan and ignored Isaiah's original intent. Jewish tradition has always understood that this passage is a critique of the king of Babylon. So the belief that Lucifer is Satan is entirely a Christian invention. So now we have to ask ourselves the uncomfortable question. If the Bible does not call Satan Lucifer, well, why does the church keep perpetuating this myth about him? Is it a mistake or is it intentional? Well, it turns out when we examine the book of Ezekiel, we see the church makes the same mistake when they try to explain Satan's origins. In Ezekiel chapter 28, the prophet mocks the Prince of Tyre because of his pride. The same thing that Isaiah does to the king of Babylon. This passage begins, "Son of man, say to the Prince of Tyre, thus says the Lord God, because your heart is lifted up, and you say, I am a god, I sit on the seat of gods in the midst of the sea, yet you are a man and not a god." As you can see here, Ezekiel is not mocking Satan. In fact, he later uses imagery to compare the king of Tyre to a cherub in Eden. In verse 13 and verse 14, he says, "You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. You were the anointed cherub who covers." Even though we are specifically told that this passage is about the Prince of Tyre, the church claims that it's describing Satan, an angel who rebelled against God. And this claim completely ignores the context. Ezekiel is not talking about Satan at all. He's ridiculing the Prince of Tyre, exaggerating his status to mock his arrogance and his inevitable fall. In verse 17, he goes on to say, "Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom. For the sake of your own splendor, I cast you to the ground. I laid you before kings, that they might gaze upon you." Now, do you think Ezekiel is saying that the kings of the earth were gazing at Satan laying on the ground? No, he's talking about the Prince of Tyre. It's obvious that the church is using these passages to invent an origin story about Satan's rebellion, even though Satan's never even mentioned in the book of Ezekiel or Isaiah, not one time. So I just don't see how this can be a mistake, especially since they intentionally leave out any reference to the king of Babylon or the Prince of Tyre. To show you how bad this is, imagine that I took Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar, a story about Caesar's rise to power and his betrayal and assassination, and then claimed that it was all about Satan and never even mentioned Julius Caesar once. And that's exactly what the church has done with Isaiah and Ezekiel. They twisted Isaiah's taunt of the king of Babylon, including his rise and fall as the morning star, Lucifer, and they do the same thing with Ezekiel's prophetic mockery of the Prince of Tyre, his beauty, splendor, and portrayal as a cherub in the Garden of Eden. Then they just reassign this imagery to Satan and fabricate a story where his pride leads him to rebellion, his fall condemns him to Hades, and he becomes the tormentor of the damned forever. This is a complete distortion of the Hebrew scriptures. So now you have to ask yourself, who is Satan then? Well, the word Satan turns out to just be a Hebrew word, untranslated. It simply means adversary or accuser. In the Hebrew Bible, it's usually a description of anyone, human or supernatural, who opposes, tests, or accuses someone else. For example, in 2 Samuel chapter 19, verse 22, King David calls those who oppose him Satans. So you can clearly see here that the meaning is an adversary. The same thing happens in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 14, where God raises up human Satans or adversaries to challenge the king of Solomon. So Satan is usually just a word that usually means an adversary. Now, however, when the Hebrew scriptures identify a supernatural being that's called the Satan, it's very clear that the Satan is an accuser or a prosecutor who operates only with God's permission. For example, in Job, the Satan tests Job's loyalty, but only after God explicitly allows it. The same thing happens in Zechariah. The Satan accuses Joshua, the high priest, but remains under God's authority. So in the Hebrew Bible, the purpose for this supernatural being that we call Satan is just to test God's servants. He is a ruthless prosecutor and an opponent because he has the authority to use slander, deception, temptation, persecution, and any means necessary to test our loyalty. And the Hebrews believed that their choice or free will to serve God had no meaning whatsoever if life was just easy and effortless. They believed that a truly righteous person remains loyal to God despite the Satan's rigorous testing. So without question, by our perspective, Satan is really evil, and the Hebrew scriptures are clear. God allows Satan to test us with methods that are evil because God is the one that creates good and evil. And this is proven in Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7. I form the light and create the darkness. I make peace and create evil. I am the Lord, and I do all these things. And this is all because when you look at the ancient Hebrew mindset, nothing lied outside of God's sovereignty, not even adversity or the evil that happens to us when we are tested. So consequently, in the Hebrew scriptures, Satan is not a rebel or the ruler of Hades. He plays the role of prosecutor. Under God's supervision, he's permitted to test humanity. And this concept of Satan as an adversary who tests us is also found in the New Testament. James chapter 1, verse 13 aligns with this Hebrew view on why people are tested. He states that it's not God that tempts people. Then he goes on to say that a person can't even be tempted to sin unless they already have the desire to do it. So for example, when a person is tested by Satan and tempted to slander someone that they don't like, they have to choose between slandering them and being honest. Now, some Christians will point to 1 John chapter 3, verse 8, where John tells the Christian community that the devil has been sinning from the beginning. However, the average Christian does not understand that the word devil is a Greek word that actually means slanderer. So, if you read the context of John, you can see that there's someone within the Christian community who has been slandering and accusing them from the beginning. And so, according to the context, this person was a deceiver acting unrighteously because they had rejected God's laws. And there's no doubt that this human is acting on behalf of the Satan in order to test the Christian community. And the thing that we have to keep in mind is the New Testament also uses the Hebrew word Satan to describe someone's opponent or adversary. In fact, in Matthew chapter 16, verse 22, Jesus specifically rebukes Peter, calling him Satan, when Peter opposes Jesus' mission and stands in the way of God's purpose. The same thing happens in John chapter 8, verse 44, where Jesus calls the religious leaders the devil or the slanderer. So this is consistent with Satan's role in the Hebrew scriptures as a challenger who slanders people in order to test them. And guess what? This understanding of the word Satan even appears in the revelation of Jesus. In Revelation chapter 2, verse 9 and chapter 3, verse 9, Jesus condemns religious groups in Smyrna and Philadelphia, calling them synagogues of Satan. And just as Jesus calls the religious authorities the devil in John 8 for their slander and deception, here he identifies the synagogue of Satan or adversaries for maligning his faithful followers. So the term Satan is again used in this Hebrew sense, referring to a human opponent who is a slanderer. However, over the centuries, the church misinterpreted how Satan is used in the revelation of Jesus, turning the word Satan into a rebellious fallen star that wars with God and rules over Hades. To support this narrative, they had to retroactively twist the words in Isaiah and Ezekiel. They reimagined Satan as Lucifer, the fallen star, a cherub from the Garden of Eden who fell from glory, and then they reassigned him as the ruler of Hades and the tormentor of the damned. And this reinterpretation makes for a sensational story about a war between God and Satan for the souls of humanity. The problem, though, with this interpretation is that it completely misses the purpose of the conflict that's actually going on in the revelation of Jesus. And it's all because the church just refuses to follow the messenger of Jesus that's built into this prophecy. This messenger is like a tour guide. He's telling you where to go and where not to go when you decide to visit this prophecy. And because the church refuses to follow this messenger's instructions, they unintentionally invoke the plagues that this messenger warns them about at the end of the revelation. So now you might be wondering, well, how does any of this have to do with me? Because I'm not even religious. Why should I care about it? Well, the reason you should really care about this is there is a reason the Christians do not want to change their errant beliefs about Satan being Lucifer, the fallen star, and the ultimate form of evil that hates and opposes God. They need this dualistic view of good and evil because it allows them to see the non-believers as servants of Satan. This belief that non-believers are indirectly serving Satan leads to distrust, hostility, and unfortunately, a lot of unfair treatment for people who are not Christians. So this wraps up part 1 of our 3-part series. In the next episode, The Revelation of Jesus Blunder, I'm going to explore how centuries ago the church misinterpreted this prophecy and why their mistakes still matter today, even if you're not religious. So hit subscribe to make sure you don't miss it. And if you have any thoughts about today's episode, please drop a comment below. Until then, keep questioning what you've been told by the church. And thank you for watching Sooth Slayer. I hope that you will join me in the next episode.